Well, hello and welcome to North Star Oasis. I'm your host, Jeff Williams. We're here for another action-packed episode. We've got a lot of content today. Thank you for joining us. All of our material is available on either YouTube or Facebook. Please join us. YouTube.com/North Star Oasis, Facebook.com/North Star Oasis. This month shapes up to be kind of like Space Month. Month of July had a lot of things going on regarding the space program, especially with the U.S. space program. And that's really what we're going to highlight today. So we're going to have some really good stuff for you. But because we have so much content, we're going to go right to it. One of the key players in the U.S. space race was President John F. Kennedy. And he is our feature on today's Prager University segment.
He was one of America's most popular presidents, handsome, charismatic, a war hero. He believed a strong military was the best guarantor of peace. He explained that cutting taxes was the best way to grow the economy. He firmly opposed racial quotas and was horrified by the idea of unrestricted abortions. Can you name him? Here's one more clue. He was not a Republican. The answer, John F. Kennedy. When he was elected president in 1960, Kennedy's views were considered mainstream in the Democratic Party. But while the Kennedy name is still revered by the Democrats today, the policies he espoused are not. Ronald Reagan, America's 40th president, who was a Democrat much of his life, famously said, "I didn't leave the Democratic Party, the party left me." So, if Kennedy were alive now, which party would he belong to? It's impossible to know, of course, but we can compare his political positions to those of today's Democratic Party. On race, JFK disliked the idea of using racial preferences and quotas to make up for historic racism and discrimination. Today, affirmative action is Democratic Party orthodoxy, but Kennedy thought such policies were counterproductive. "I don't think we can undo the past," Kennedy said. "We have to do the best we can now. I don't think quotas are a good idea. We are too mixed, this society of ours, to begin to divide ourselves on the basis of race or color." On taxes, Kennedy was an ardent proponent of across-the-board tax cuts, believing that more cash in the hands of all Americans, including the so-called wealthy, and a lighter footprint from the IRS would grow the economy. A tax cut means higher family income and higher business profits, Kennedy said in an address to the nation shortly before his death. Every taxpayer and his family will have more money left over after taxes for a new car, a new home, new conveniences, education, and investment. Every businessman can keep a higher percentage of his profits in his cash register or put it to work expanding or improving his business. On foreign policy, Kennedy was very firm about his red lines. When the Soviet Union built missile sites in Cuba, leading to what is known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy threatened a decisive military response. The Soviet Union backed down. JFK believed, as Ronald Reagan did, in peace through strength, not strength through peace. In his inaugural address, Kennedy made the case for a strong U.S. military. He saw this as the only way to deter America's enemies. "Only when our arms are sufficient beyond doubt," he said, "can we be certain beyond doubt that they will never be employed." On gun rights, Kennedy was one of 8 U.S. presidents who was a lifetime member of the NRA. Here's what he said about the Second Amendment. "We need a nation of Minutemen, citizens who are not only prepared to take up arms, but citizens who regard the preservation of freedom as a basic purpose of their daily life, and who are willing to consciously work and sacrifice for that freedom." On abortion, Kennedy was assassinated a decade before the landmark Supreme Court case Roe v. Wade. Abortion was not a major issue during his administration, but we do know that he nominated Justice Byron White, a Democrat, to the Supreme Court. White was one of 2 justices who dissented in Roe v. Wade. We also know that Kennedy abhorred Japan's post-World War II use of abortion as a means of population control, saying, "On the question of limiting population, as you know, the Japanese have been doing it very vigorously through abortion, which I think would be repugnant to all Americans." Today, if a Democrat advocated the positions on race, taxes, foreign policy, guns, and abortion that our 35th president once did, he wouldn't be a Democrat. He belonged to that other party. I'm Larry Elder for Prager University.
So either President John F. Kennedy would have stayed true to his convictions if he were still alive today, and he would have become a Republican, or, like his younger brother Ted, would have changed his convictions for political expediency. But as of 1959 and into the 1960s, that was John F. Kennedy, who would no longer be welcome with the Democratic Party today. Now, what has that got to do with space? John F. Kennedy was a mover and shaker when it came to his vision for space. And we're now going to start highlighting this. And when I say we're going to start highlighting is the space age really began in 1957. This is before President Kennedy was elected. But during President Eisenhower's administration, we had the launch of Sputnik. And we're going to actually show you the launch of Sputnik, the story of Sputnik 1, from the Russian perspective, from the perspective of those who were from the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union. This is their perspective on Sputnik 1. This is broadcast in Russian, but there is English subtitles, so you may have to do a little reading.
«4 октября 1957 года. В кабинете президента Соединенных Штатов Дуайта Эйзенхауэра раздается тревожный звонок. Генерал из Пентагона сообщил, русские вывели в космос ядерную бомбу. Эйзенхауэр срочно созывает совещание. Когда первая информация просочилась в СМИ, Америку охватила паника. Вскоре тысячи радиостанций по всему миру стали ловить необычные сигналы из космоса. Одновременно с ними в ночном небе появилась маленькая движущаяся звездочка. Это была не бомба. Впервые в истории объект, созданный руками человека, преодолел силу земного притяжения. Радиосигнал стал символом начала новой эры, космической. Спутник, собранный меньше чем за месяц, весил всего 84 килограмма. Кодовое обозначение ПС-1, простейший спутник, первый. На нем установили 2 радиопередатчика для разных частот. По длине радиосигналов на Байконуре должны были определять температуру и давление внутри аппарата. Теперь оставалось отправить спутник в космос.
Готовность 15 минут. Дежурному расчету покинуть стартовую площадку. Доложить об эвакуации людей и техники. Дежурным пожарным командам принять готовность номер 1. Зажигание. Предварительное. Главное. Подъем.
4 октября 1957 года. Московское время 22 часа 28 минут. В этот момент ракета Р-7 со спутником в головной части стартовала в космос. Реакция мировой общественности на это событие была бурной. Люди на разных континентах выходили ночью из своих домов, смотрели на небо и видели, среди привычных неподвижных звезд одна движется. Первыми в США засекли сигналы русского спутника не военные, а радиолюбители. Радио и телекомпании прервали передачи, чтобы все услышали эти звуки. Спутник просуществовал на орбите 92 дня. Когда в начале января 1958 года он сгорал в верхних слоях атмосферы, на орбите уже летал второй советский аппарат. И лишь через месяц, в феврале 1958 года, Соединенные Штаты смогли запустить свой первый спутник. Сегодня по околоземным орбитам летают тысячи сложных космических аппаратов. Целая система, у истоков которой стоял первый маленький советский спутник.
Now, whenever the Soviet Union, during the Cold War, was planning something really big, Berlin Wall, for instance, just before they constructed the Berlin Wall, they did something in space. The space race really was an extension of the Cold War. It was a new frontier. The United States and the Soviet Union were fighting each other for space, just like they were fighting proxy wars and some hot wars here on Earth. So with Sputnik, that was kind of like the first shot. And because that was such a success, the Russian government decided that they were going to do something else spectacular 1 month later in November as a commemoration of the Russian Revolution. And I believe the equivalent date would have been November 7th. And so on November 3rd and November 4th, they launched Sputnik 2. Sputnik 2 carried a live dog named Laika. So let's take a look at this.
Всем советским людям особенно приятно, что коллективы научно-исследовательских институтов, конструкторских бюро, заводов и исполнительных организаций, создавшие новую ракету, посвящает этот спуск 21-му съезду Коммунистической партии Советского Союза.
Now, Laika had made 3.5, roughly. Might have been a little bit more. I just can't quite remember how many orbits. But the dog was never meant to return back to Earth. One of the early tests that was happening with animals was just trying to see whether or not mammals can exist in space. Will the radiation be harmful for any living species? And it also allowed both the U.S. and the Russians to test different reentry procedures, which didn't exist in 1957. They could shoot up rockets, but they couldn't necessarily, especially when a payload got into orbit, they couldn't exactly retrieve it. So that's why both Sputniks, actually all three Sputniks, ended up just burning up when they re-entered the Earth's atmosphere, including Laika. It was I think the dog was alive between 5 and 7 hours, and then that was it. They had different electrodes on the dog's body to test all the different vitals, and it went silent. The dog had an elevated heart rate, was panicking, and was getting overheated, and then died. That actually had such a huge outcry around the world, and in Britain especially, it led kind of to the beginning of the animal rights activism. And we've discussed the animal rights people on the show many times before, especially when it comes to circus animals and how they may have the best of intentions, but what they actually do hurts more than helps. This kind of is what started all of that. There was concern about a dog, and the big bad Russians let that harmless, helpless little dog to die in space. And that gave rise to the animal rights movement. But on the other hand, you have to kind of say they did need a test. And unfortunately, Laika was a sacrificial dog. And even Russian people working on that project 50 years later came out and said, well, we weren't quite ready, we should never have sent the dog. But that's the way it was back then with the decision makers. And so how did the United States respond? Because obviously the U.S. responded. Well, they responded not by sending a dog, but by sending 2 monkeys into space. A rhesus monkey that was born in the Indianapolis Zoo, not Indianapolis, Independence, Kansas Zoo, named Abel, and then a spider monkey born in Peru and purchased at a Miami, Florida pet shop named Baker, and they were sent on a Jupiter rocket in 1959, 2 years after Laika made her trip. So let's take a look at Abel and Baker and how they met the press after their flight.
At Cape Canaveral, 2 tiny astronauts, monkeys Abel and Baker, are readied for the first flight into outer space and safe return of Earth flight. Dressed in protective spacesuits and wired so that readings on their physiological reactions can be transmitted to the ground, the rhesus monkey and the much smaller squirrel monkey are secured in separate capsules in the nose cone of a Jupiter missile. Prime purpose of the flight was to test the nose cone re-entry. In a sense, the monkeys were hitchhikers. 300 miles out into space they travel. 15 minutes and 1,700 ground miles later, the capsule is fished from the waters of the Caribbean, where it re-entered the atmosphere. The recovery shown in these Defense Department films is made by the Navy tug Kiowa. Aboard of the ship, a team of biomedical specialists waits to examine the nose cone's passengers. The cone itself is in good shape after the fiery plunge through space. Abel and Baker are unswathed from their protective garb, and they prove sturdy little explorers indeed. Physically unharmed and in jolly good spirits, the first creatures from outer space in all history. Baker, the tiny squirrel monkey, is more interested in food than fame. And Abel, the rhesus, is downright blasé about the whole thing. A little later, the space monkeys meet the press at the headquarters of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration in Washington. They brought back the best evidence yet that humans can function and survive in outer space. Pathfinders for the spacemen of tomorrow.
And because Abel and Baker managed to make it safely back to Earth, that had proven that space flight for humans could actually occur. Now, for those of you who had watched the show for a while, you know that I am a huge collector of historic items. For those of you who are just tuning in, I am a huge collector of historic items. And I will show you this. This is June 15th, 1959, a Life magazine. And this particular magazine features Abel and Baker, the 2 monkeys that we had just shown. Abel actually died on the 1st of June 1959 when they were removing some of the electrodes from her body. But yet Baker, the squirrel monkey who is right here, she ended up dying in like 1984 as the oldest squirrel monkey ever known to have lived at like age 27. Usually they live anywhere between like 10, 15 years or 9 years, something like that. And yet she managed to live into 1984, long past her normal life expectancy. And there were many school children over the years who ended up writing letters to Miss Baker, and somebody from NASA or Air Force Public Affairs ended up writing back to everybody, and all these school children had all their Miss Baker letters. I did not take advantage of that, and that is actually one of the regrets I have to this day. I talked about this with a classmate of mine. He was actually 2 years older than me, and he admitted to me he still has his letter. I'm still jealous. But he did say that, well, you've got the Life magazine, which kind of trumps the letter. But, you know, Miss Baker was always one of the most popular astronauts with school children. And she's actually buried at the U.S. Space and Rocket Center on the grounds in Huntsville, Alabama. And if you ever go down there, make sure you bring a banana and leave it on the top of her tombstone. That is tradition. So now what happened? We have Able and Baker land. The space program has proven that it can face humans. Humans can exist in space. Well, what we're going to show you next, it goes back to the Russians, but what you're going to hear is Yuri Gagarin. He is the first human being to go into space and to orbit the Earth. But you're also going to hear instructions given to him by Sergei Korolev, who is the father of the Soviet space program. And for many, 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 many years, people in the United States did not know who he was. He was always mysterious. And he died back in 1964 or 65, somewhere in there. And it was after he died that we understood who he was. And there's still stories that abound about Korolev and his management of that program and how it became successful for so long. So let's take a look at the radio communications between Yuri Gagarin and Sergei Korolev.
Федор, я один. Как слышите меня? Буду вам транслировать команды. Прием. Минутная готовность. Кедр, я Заря-1. Внимание, минутная готовность. Минутная готовность.
Заря-1, я Кедр. Вас понял, минутная готовность. Занимал исходное положение, занял. Поэтому несколько задержал с ответом. Прием.
Ключ на старт. Ключ на старт. Есть старт. Протяжка 1. Есть протяжка. Продувка. 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 Есть продувка. Ключ на дренаж. Ключ на дренаж. Есть дренаж. Зажигание. Кедр, я Заря-1. Зажигание.
Понял, дается зажигание.
Предварительное. Желаю вам доброго полета. Я Заря-1. Мы все желаем вам доброго полета. Все нормально.
And that just happens to be footage that you never see anywhere. And that's one of the unique things we try to bring you at North Star Oasis, is the stuff that is a little bit different than what you normally see out there, because there's plenty of footage available of seeing his rocket go up, but there isn't too much to see about the actual behind-the-scenes voice communications from that historic day. So now, how did the United States respond? Less than a month later, May 5th, 1961, we sent Alan Shepard into space on a suborbital flight.
All right, lift off and the clock has started.
Now, of course, back then, space wasn't quite so crowded, not quite like it is today. Alan Shepard, neither Shepard nor Gagarin really had to worry about any type of orbital space debris from satellites and any other things like that that had occurred, especially in low Earth orbit, unlike today. We've really crowded the skies. I bring that up because no sooner did Alan Shepard land than John F. Kennedy, who we had played a clip about earlier, decided to change the stakes. He changed the stakes in the space race. the Cold War game between the United States and the Soviet Union. We had finally achieved suborbital flight. Yuri Gagarin had made orbital flight. Eventually, we would send John Glenn. We had an initial 7 Project Mercury astronauts. 6 of them actually made flights. And then, even before the other flights got off the ground, President Kennedy decided that we're going to really put some hefty goals in front of us and mobilize us as a country to win this race as part of the Cold War. And this is a speech he gave just a couple of weeks after Shepard had finished his successful flight.
These are extraordinary times, and we face an extraordinary challenge. Our strength as well as our convictions have imposed upon this nation the role of leader in freedom's cause. Now going on around the world between freedom and tyranny, the dramatic achievements in space which occurred in recent weeks should have made clear to us all, as did the Sputnik in 1957, the impact of this adventure on the minds of men everywhere who are attempting to make a determination of which road they should take. Since early in my term, our efforts in space have been under review. With the advice of the Vice President, who is Chairman of the National Space Council, we have examined where we are strong and where we are not, where we may succeed and where we may not. Now it is time to take longer strides, time for a great new American enterprise, time for this nation to take a clearly leading role in space achievement, which in many ways may hold the key to our future on Earth. I believe we possess all the resources and talents necessary, but the facts of the matter are that we have never made the national decisions or marshaled the national resources required for such leadership. We have never specified long-range goals on an urgent time schedule or managed our resources and our time so as to ensure their fulfillment. I therefore ask the Congress, above and beyond the increases I have earlier requested for space activities, to provide the funds which are needed to meet the following national goals. First, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish. In conclusion, let me emphasize one point. It is not a pleasure for any President of the United States, as I'm sure it was not a pleasure for my predecessor, to come before the Congress and ask for new appropriations which place burdens on our people. I came to this conclusion with some reluctance. But in my judgment, this is a most serious time in the life of our country and in the life of freedom around the globe. And it is the obligation, I believe, of the President of the United States to at least make his recommendations to the members of the Congress so that they can reach their own conclusions with that judgment before them. You must decide yourselves as I have decided. And I am confident that whether you finally decide in the way that I have decided or not, that your judgment, as my judgment, is reached on what is in the best interest of our country.
Now, isn't that a breath of fresh air? We haven't heard that from a president in a while, from both parties, mind you. But contrast John F. Kennedy saying that this is my vision, this is my plan, this is an enterprise, this is what we want to build, this is what we're going to rally around, this is what is going to define us as Americans. Contrast that with the last Democratic president we had, who snipped the space program, who said, well, we're going to retire the space shuttle, and we're going to take away any other prospect of going to the moon. We're going to the Constellation program that was underway under his predecessor. Well, we're going to just do away with that. We won't really get back into manned space flight until 2017. And then we're actually going to pay $75 million per seat to the Russians to carry American astronauts to the International Space Center, International Space Station. That is what the last Democratic president had done. Contrast that with John F. Kennedy, a Democratic president. Night and day difference, folks. That's how far the Democratic Party has strayed from their roots. If the Democratic Party is going to change and become relevant in society again, they need to go back and embrace the ideals of John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. And they'll get back on track. That is really about the only major political thing I'm going to say the entire day. But it's just a huge contrast between Barack Obama and John F. Kennedy. I just had to make that comparison. So now, what happened after Kennedy's speech? The Russians reacted. Now, of course, they'd already sent up Vostok, which is what Gagarin and some of the other early astronauts had done. And then they went up with Voskhod, I still can't quite pronounce that. But Voskhod was a two-man capsule, and it was designed to try to get towards the moon, and Soyuz was their moon capsule. The Americans had Project Mercury, the suborbital flights, then the orbital flights. Then they had Gemini. Gemini was essentially the same as Voskhod. And then they had Apollo, which is to go to the moon. And then, even though the Soviets were the first ones to actually do what's called an EVA, extravehicular activity, meaning going outside of the spacecraft, for the Americans it was Ed White on Gemini 4 who was able to actually make our first EVA and our first spacewalk. Let's take a look.
We have a roll program initiated.
8.5 Gs, you're really being pushed into the seat, and all of a sudden, it stops. You're floating. It's a lot of fun.
The crew went through the preparation process. They reported we were ready.
Yeah, my phone.
I had a tracking station make sure that all of the safety criteria had been met, and this was now okay to open up the hatch.
Okay, we're giving you a go for your EVA at this time.
Okay.
Roger, flight, let's go. Okay.
After we got the hatch open, Ed stood up in the seat and got ready to go, and we cleared him to go, and then he took and pushed off from the seat.
Okay, my feet are out. I think I'm dragging a little bit, so I don't want to fire the gun yet. Okay, I'm separating from the spacecraft.
Ed White is flying at 17,000 miles per hour, 200 miles above the Earth.
Okay, I'm out.
If the spacesuit fails, the difference in pressure will kill him instantly. If the lifeline fails, he'll literally be lost in space.
The only thing to do would be to disconnect them and let them float around out there. I mean, it was, you know, these are things that's in everybody's mind. We don't have a plan. We don't have a checklist on how you kill your best friend.
As White floats in space, a glove drifts out of the capsule.
Looks like a thermal glove, Jim.
I don't even know whose glove it was. I don't know whether it was his or mine.
I feel like $1 million.
Today, those pictures are a classic. They're still overpowering today to realize, number one, it's been done, and that we did it. It blew me away.
This is the greatest experience. It's just tremendous.
And the person with the vest was Gene Kranz, who was mission control. He was the flight director at the Kennedy Space Center. And then the other person was Jim McDivitt, who was a fellow Gemini 4 astronaut. So Ed White made the first successful spacewalk for an American. The other Gemini flights had done other similar tests, docking two capsules together, other spacewalks, a whole bunch of other tests that they needed in order to execute their plan for the Apollo missions. Then came a huge setback, Apollo 1. This is when, and mind you, as I've gotten away from the Soviet space footage, the Russians were dealing with the same problem. They lost a few astronauts, and this is the first time that Americans lost astronauts. As Gus Grissom from both Mercury and Gemini flights or programs, he lost his life along with Ed White, the first spacewalker, and then Roger Chaffee, who was one of the newer astronauts. January 27th, 1967, they were testing the Apollo 1 capsule in 100% oxygen environment, and a fire broke out inside the capsule and they died. Let's take a look.
Astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, assigned to the first Apollo mission, perished when fire engulfed the interior of their spacecraft during a launch rehearsal on January 27, 1967.
So in January 1967, it looked like Apollo program was done, that the Russians were going to beat the Americans into space, to the moon, and it looked like there was no hope. But the program continued. Now, they didn't launch another Apollo mission until Apollo 4 in November of that year, so there was a good 10 months. And the next 3 Apollo flights, 4, 5, and 6, did not carry any astronauts. They were still doing a lot of testing. They had redesigned the entire Apollo capsule, changed the atmosphere from 100% oxygen to an oxygen-nitrogen mix, changed the pressure, did a whole bunch of things, changed the spacesuit even. So then Apollo 7, October 11th to 22nd, 1968, Wally Schirra, Walt Cunningham, and Don Isley went into space on a manned Earth orbital demonstration and was the first live television publicly broadcast from a manned mission. Then came Apollo 8 a couple of months later, December 21st to 27th. That was the first manned flight to the moon. Then came Apollo 9 in March of 1969, just 4 months later, actually 3 months later, it was March 3rd. And that was the first manned flight of the command module and the lunar module in Earth orbit. And then they demonstrated a portable life support system that was to be used on the lunar surface. Apollo 10 with Thomas Stafford, John Young, and Gene Cernan. That was a dress rehearsal for the first lunar landing, May 18th to 26th, 1969. And they actually came within like 8 nautical miles of the moon or something like that. It was really, really close, or 60 nautical miles. It was just as close as they could get. There was actually some talk that Apollo 10 might have been able to do it. Then came Apollo 11. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins, and they landed on the moon.
At 15 seconds, guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. We have a liftoff. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
Shadow. 4 forward, drift into the right a little. 30 seconds. Forward, drift. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue.
We're going to be busy for a minute.
Armstrong is on the moon. Neil Armstrong, 38-year-old American, standing on the surface of the moon. On this July 20th, 1969.
It's one small step for man. One giant leap for mankind. Oh, that looks beautiful, Neil. It has a stark beauty all its own. It's like much of the high desert of the United States. It's different, but it's very pretty out here. Beautiful, beautiful. Isn't that something? Magnificent sight out here. Magnificent desolation.
Tranquility Base, Houston. Guidance recommendation is pings, and you're cleared for takeoff.
Roger, understand. We're number 1 on the runway. 7, 6, 5, engine arm ascent. Beautiful. Very smooth. Very quiet ride.
Apollo 11, this is Hornet, over.
Apollo 1, this is Apollo 11, reach the launch course. Our position 1330.
And yes, Americans walk on moon with the world as witness. This is the Toledo Blade from July 21st, 1969. It was a Monday. And we had accomplished the goal. America had beaten the Russians to the moon. And here is the proof. Of course, this is one of several July 21st, 1969 newspapers that I had purchased over the years. I will also make one other interesting observation about this particular edition of a newspaper. Because we're talking about John F. Kennedy, there's another Kennedy thing that happened at the same time. that happened to have been Ted Kennedy ended up driving off of a bridge at Chappaquiddick on the same day that the astronauts made it onto the moon. Killed Mary Jo Kopechne, almost killed a Senate career too. And so I find it quite interesting that his brother wanted to make getting to the moon and back safely his primary mission as president. And yet on the very day that that goal was accomplished came Chappaquiddick. That's just one of those ironic situations that I don't think anybody could have ever planned. But I wanted to point that out, and then I also have one other thing. I do have a plaque. Okay, there we go. This is a recreation, a replica of what is actually on the moon. This is the one that says, "Here men from the planet Earth first set foot on the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind." And so it's just a replica, but still I think it's just a kind of a cool item to have. And all of the lunar missions that we had landed people on the moon ended up having plaques like that that were already on the lunar module. And when the astronauts went back to the command module, the section with the ladder with that particular plaque stayed on the moon's surface. And there's a lunar reconnaissance satellite that actually has taken photos of the different sites on the moon where Americans had landed. We had landed 6 flights on the moon, commencing with Apollo 11, ending with Apollo 17. Apollo 13 should have made it, but it didn't. That was the second failed, if you can even call it a failure, mission. They couldn't land on the moon because of a explosion that happened in one of the fuel tanks, and they ended up going around the moon in a crippled craft and then made it back to Earth safely. Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes were the astronauts on that aircraft. And that was the other failure. Gene Cernan was the last man to set foot on the moon. He was the commander of Apollo 17, and sadly, this past January, Gene Cernan, the astronaut, passed away at the age of 82. I was actually fortunate to have met him once in my career. So it's just sad that we lost another spacewalking astronaut. But here, Apollo 11, Apollo 12, Apollo 14, 15, 16, 17, and then budget cutbacks. We accomplished that. Going to space, going to the moon, that was all passé. It was routine. Nobody paid attention to the ratings anymore. Congress is saying we're going to trim the budget. And then what do? Well, the plan, it started before, of course, before the budget cutbacks, but there was an office in NASA on what to do with all of this, all these space parts, and they'd actually designed the first American space station, and it was called Skylab. And so Skylab, using surplus Apollo parts, took the place of the Apollo moon flights. Let's take a look.
Almost 10 years before the space shuttle first launched, and 25 years before the first pieces of the International Space Station were connected, NASA launched Skylab, a home above our home planet.
Hello and welcome. I'm John Coward. NASA has long focused on finding out how astronauts can live and work in space. Finding the answer to that was one of the many reasons behind building the International Space Station. But it was also the driving question meant to be solved by America's first space station, an orbital workshop called Skylab. By the time the last crew left in February 1974, astronauts spent more time in space than all of NASA's previous missions combined. Their research would set the stage for today's successes on board the International Space Station.
NASA and the United States had not yet landed on the moon when the idea of a space station started taking shape.
Our objective was, in the first place, to get a lot of medical information so that we could have enough data to allow the space station to have crews that could stay up there for 6 months.
The result was Skylab, a workplace in space designed to host scientific discovery without forgetting the comforts of life on Earth. The workshop was built into an empty third stage from a Saturn V moon rocket. A pair of solar wings would fold out to provide electricity for the life support and research equipment inside. The 3-man crew would arrive in an Apollo capsule launched aboard another rocket. A telescope to study the sun and other instruments were mounted atop the workshop, and they were powered by 4 separate solar arrays that gave Skylab a windmill appearance. The finished complex was folded up, fit into a nose cone on top of a Saturn V rocket, and launched into orbit from Kennedy Space Center in Florida on May 14, 1973. But the ascent soon grew too rough for the space station, and the air rushing over the outside of the Saturn V tore off one of the large solar panels and a crucial heat shield meant to protect the workshop. The second large solar panel was stuck in place, and Skylab reached orbit critically low on electricity. Engineers struggled to find a fix for the outpost, and it fell to the first Skylab crew to make it work.
The situation that faced our crew as we launched, of course, was the broke Skylab. It was hot. It lacked electrical power. The whole program might be lost, and we launched with a command module full of instruments, many of which we had never seen before. They handed us the checklist kind of on the way in and said, "Good luck, guys."
Moonwalker Pete Conrad and astronauts Joe Kerwin and Paul Weitz lifted off May 25th with a kit to save the mission.
The clock is running, and Skylab has cleared the tower.
The astronauts found the crippled Skylab as they expected and quickly deployed a sun shield over the exposed section of the laboratory.
But when we lost that heat shield, we proved that man was a very, very vital part of space exploration, and that he could do a lot of repairs and fixes.
Repairs and improvements would follow throughout the Skylab program, including spacewalks that ultimately freed that stuck solar panel. With Skylab back in shape, 3 crews of astronauts would go on to prove they could handle weeks at a time in microgravity with few ill effects. They recorded brilliant images of the sun and took the first pictures of solar flares. And they turned sensitive instruments toward Earth, offering the first comprehensive studies of our home planet.
Skylab was a pioneering home for astronauts in several ways.
So that was getting Skylab into space, and they had 3 crews, as they just mentioned. Unfortunately, there was not a whole lot they can do. The next space program that they had on the drawing boards was the space shuttle. The space shuttle was not ready. It was on delay. It was on perpetual hold. And because the Skylab was crippled and with excess solar radiation coming in, its orbit was lowering more and more and more until eventually, by July of 1979, it burned up on re-entry. Let's take a look at what happened.
Today in Space, July 11th. In 1979, the abandoned U.S. space station Skylab made a spectacular return to Earth as it burned up in the atmosphere, showering debris over the Indian Ocean and Western Australia. The last crew left the space station in 1974. Over time, it began to deorbit, slowly sinking closer and closer to Earth. Skylab actually fell back to Earth a little sooner than NASA anticipated. Strong solar storms were blamed for this premature plunge because solar activity had warmed up Earth's atmosphere. As pieces of Skylab broke up in the atmosphere, residents and pilots in the area saw dozens of colorful firework-like flares. And that's what happened today in space.
When I was, 7 years old, was it? Just prior to my 8th birthday, Skylab was breaking up. It was in the news. You paid attention every single day. It was like the lead story. This is what's happening with Skylab. This is what the plans are for Skylab. Skylab's going to crash. And as a 7-year-old boy, soon about to turn 8, I was kind of silently hoping that Skylab would crash over my grandparents' house in Michigan so I could get a piece. lo and behold, 30 years later, there was one that actually came out on the market. And so right here is a piece of Skylab. And if you notice here, there's a little bit of a burn section. And just a little bit ago, they'd shown a graphic of one of the oxygen tanks, and it was kind of covered in what looked like bark. Well, this is a section from that particular part of the fuel tank. These are kind of hard to come by, but I managed to procure one, and it fulfilled a lifelong ambition that I wanted a piece of Skylab. And yes, here it is. But Skylab was kind of a precursor to the International Space Station. But there was one other thing that was a precursor to the ISS, and that was Apollo-Soyuz. This was the first U.S.-Soviet cooperation in space. It was the first time the Cold War had really paused. And we sent Deke Slayton, one of the first 7 Mercury astronauts. He was grounded with an arrhythmia, and it had corrected by the time of 1975. And so he was on the flight along with Tom Stafford and Vance Brand. And then you had Alexei Leonov, and I cannot remember Valerie. Can't remember the other cosmonaut, but they met in space. So let's take a look at Apollo-Soyuz, 1975.
Информация была транслирована. Очень хорошо. Половина метров. Меньше, чем 5 метров раздачи.
Hey Houston, can you close down the f-stop some?
3 метров. 1 метров. Послание. Capture. Yes, capture. Actually, значит, жителей видите. Пожалуйста, да. Иди сюда. Да, иди сюда, да. Okay, turn on the camera. Hit the remote. Okay. Here. Glad to see you. Here. Pass it to Alexei.
And yes, I even have a telephone from Mission Control at Kennedy Space Center from that era. But I'll tell you this, as we leave you for this week, the Apollo reunion will be held at the EAA Air Show in Oshkosh tomorrow, July 28th. So North Star Oasis will be there. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.